Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. We'll get started in about 2 more minutes or so, just letting people catch up and hop on and all that good stuff. So thank you all very much. Just 1 more minute. We'll get kicked off. And Steve, you're right. I should have did this from my gym, or I could have did it from the DeLorean as well. That'd have been fun as well. The DeLorean's actually in the shop though. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get this kicked off. Really appreciate everybody joining today to talk about the Log4J issues that obviously got released last week, and that everybody's trying to figure out what's going on. We have some amazing folks on this, folks that are dealing with this day in and day out, both from a binary defense and trusted sec perspective. We got Tyler Hudak, who runs our incident response team. We got Randy Pargman, who runs our threat intelligence team. We got Justin Elzy, who's head of our research and red team. And so, we have a lot of stuff, both from a understanding of what this vulnerability is, what it's doing, what we're seeing from a attacker's perspective, an incident response perspective, all of what you're going to need to know. And, our whole intent here is to kind of give you a quick walkthrough of everything that's going on, the latest and greatest information, as well as have any of you ask any questions that you want. We're more than welcome to answer any questions. We hope this becomes more of a Q&A session to get all of the answers that you need for this to hopefully help remediate this as things go along. But really our goal here is to get everybody together, talk about it, go through it, and really try to hit those expectations of everything to help you address this as quick as possible. Next slide. So just want to say special thanks to Trusted Second Binary Defense. Both companies that I founded here. We have some awesome people on both sides, both on the defense and offensive side, talking about this and going through it. Trusted Sec, a security consulting organization located in Cleveland, Ohio, binary defense, a MSSP monitoring detection company on the managed detection and response side, located in Stowe, Ohio, with folks all over the country and world. Happy to help out with anything that we possibly can for any folks that are out there today. Next slide. So just a brief introduction, and I'll let them do their introduction too. I don't want to have to go through each one, but I'm Dave Kennedy. I'm the founder and CEO of Trusted Sec, and founder and CTO over at Binary Defense. Been in the security industry for 30 years and really focused on the security side of the house. Tyler?
Yeah, so I'm Tyler Hudak. I'm the practice lead of incident response for Trusted Sec. Lead a really amazing team of incident responders. We've been doing, as you can imagine, we've been getting a lot of calls around Log4J and everything.
I felt so bad for you guys this weekend.
You know what? Incident response means weekend work. You don't get into that without knowing it. So it's all good. But yeah, well, with that, I'll turn it over to Randy.
All right. Thanks very much. Really great to be here with all of my friends from Trusted Sec. I'm Randy Pargman. I lead the threat hunting and counterintelligence teams over at Binary Defense. This weekend has been a great learning opportunity. I think anytime one of these things comes up, we learn more about technology stacks than we ever thought possible in a very short amount of time, and then try to apply that to practically what can we do with that? How can we detect? How can we defend? And just working collaboratively with not only Trusted Sec, but the whole community has been a really positive experience to see how much people are sharing. Over to Justin.
And I'm Justin Elzy. I'm the CTO at Trusted Sec. I'm also over the research team and the red team. And I'm really just here to kind of bring like an offensive flavor to the conversations we have back and forth between the defense team, the IR side, just a different perspective for everybody.
Awesome. Thanks. Now, a couple of quick housekeeping items. Obviously, there's a chat on the right-hand side. Here, please use the Q&A side of the house so that we can kind of keep that orderly and organized. There's a lot of chat going on the main chat window. If you could use the Q&A button to ask your questions, and then we'll definitely make sure that we hit on those, and I'll moderate those as we go along and go through them. But with that, I'll kick it off to Tyler.
All right, thank you. So like Dave said, obviously, you're all here because of the log4j vulnerability. This is huge news. Everybody is aware of this since it, was kind of released last week. And, our goal here, just to reiterate, the information that we're going to have in here is probably not new information if you've been keeping up with this. We're going to go through some things. Every other webcast, every other blog post that's out there, it probably has much of the same information. So our goal here is to try to get through this information as fast as we can, because we want the majority of this being us answering the questions that you have. But with that, let's get through this kind of information. So some quick facts, log4j, it's vulnerable. Version 2 is vulnerable up to version 2.14.1. Version 1 is not vulnerable to this particular vulnerability by default. That being said, if you are still on version 1, that's not a good thing. There are lots of CVEs for it. For some versions, there are remote code execution vulnerabilities for it. So being on version 1 is not necessarily a good thing. The exploit itself, the vulnerability itself, allows unauthenticated remote code execution. So in other words, you can, in the worst case scenario for this, you can send a string to a server on the internet and it will execute the code directly that you give it. In addition to remote code execution, there are ways that you could steal sensitive environment variables on servers through DNS, such as AWS keys or anything else that might be within an environment variable. And this is what we've seen happen so far. This vulnerability is still very young. It's a little bit over a week, if not even a week. And so as time progresses, we're going to see this we're going to see what can be done with this, I think, expand out. So how do you react to this? Well, the first thing you need to do is identify your vulnerable systems. You can't patch and you can't mitigate until you know what systems to patch and mitigate. So I know that there are a lot of tools out there like Nessus, Rapid7, and some other vulnerability scanning tools that do have signatures for this. But the thing to keep in mind is that network vulnerability scans are not sufficient if you are only doing a scan across your environment. They're a good start, but there's a lot that you can implement beyond that. We have seen false negatives with vulnerability scanners where they will scan an environment and they won't detect a vulnerable server. You have to also remember that by default, unless you go in and make the configuration, most vulnerability scanners do not do authenticated scans. So if your log4j logging mechanism is behind a authentication wall, then your vulnerability scanner may not detect it. And plus, most vulnerability scanners do not check every single input. So how do you go about and find your vulnerable systems? Well, one of the first ways is to go and look actually on your systems for what software you have installed. Most software, because log4j is going to be a dependency or embedded within a piece of an application, you're not going to see that in a application list on the server. So you have to go in and do some more in-depth analysis. We've listed two tools here, Sift and Gripe, which will go through, you can run it on a server and it will go through and list out all of the dependencies you have on the server, including version numbers, and that will allow you to see if you have the vulnerable versions of log4j on there. We've also found another free scanning tool, which goes beyond most vulnerability scanners, called log4j-scan. This seems to be fairly comprehensive in that it is testing multiple inputs. You can do a lot with it, so we would recommend checking this particular program out if you're going to go through and scan your environment. So after you identify the systems that you need to patch. How do you go and how do you patch it? Well, right now, the best way to do that is to upgrade to version 2.16.0. There is version 2.15.0. You can also upgrade to that. In fact, many of you probably did that over the weekend. The difference between 2.15 and 2.16 is that 2.16 has completely removed the JNDI capabilities from the code. So in other words, all of the it's not a patch of the vulnerability code or the vulnerable code. They just completely ripped it out, which is a good thing. When you look at what this vulnerability was and you kind of the technical details, it didn't need to have this in there. I'm sure others would argue against that. However, that's why we're in the situation that we're in. So if you can upgrade to 2.15, upgrade to 2.16. If you've already upgraded to 2.15, you're probably good, but I would still recommend upgrading to 16. One note as well. There were 2 release candidate patches that came out prior to the official 2.15.0 release, release candidate 1 and release candidate 2. Release candidate 1 is still vulnerable. So if you patched 2.15.0-RC1, you still need to upgrade. So what if you can't upgrade? What if for whatever reason you have dependencies for that particular version? Maybe there's lots of reasons. Well, if you are on a version of Log4j of 2.10 or beyond, there is a system property that you can set called Log4j2.format message no lookups, or an environment variable for the same one. If you set that to true, then it will not perform the attack. Another way to do this is to just completely remove the JNDI lookup class from the code. We have an example command here. This command is nothing new. It's been all over the place. But this is definitely one way that you can go and just rip that out of your code. Understanding that if you do any of these mitigations, definitely go in and test. You may have dependencies within your applications which require these to work. Ripping these out or making it not be able to do lookups might have some effect to your application. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Randy to talk about monitoring and active detection.
All right, thank you very much, Tyler. I really appreciate that. Of course, the best thing that you can do is to mitigate by patching software. But some of these vulnerable pieces of software are not going to be custom applications that you can just go in and modify the Log4j version yourself. You might need to wait for a vendor to put things out. And even now, there are a lot of software vendors that are still anticipating releases of patches in the next few days or in the next few weeks. So you might not be able to mitigate it right away. So what do you do in the meantime? It's really important to, once you've identified those vulnerable systems, turn up your monitoring, make sure that you have visibility over those. I know that a lot of the companies that we work with, and even in our own lab, we try to limit the amount of logging to just what is absolutely necessary, so that we're not, spending too much on the budget. But this would be one time to kind of splurge on making sure that you've got enough capability to ingest all the logs that you need to identify if you have a system that has been compromised. Something else that you can do is isolate those systems that are vulnerable, and make sure that they can't do a lot of damage to the inside of your network. If somebody compromises something in your DMZ, you don't want it to be pivoting to your domain controllers and installing ransomware or something like that. So not only turn up your monitoring, but also make sure that you've minimized the amount of damage that one of those systems could do if they have been compromised. Something that has been very, very useful for our threat hunting team is looking at the pattern of what is normal, especially for certain web applications that usually have very standard patterns of network lookups. What domain names do they look up? What connections do they make? In most web applications, and I want to be clear, this vulnerability is not just in web application servers, but that's what most people have been focusing on just because they're the most exposed to the internet. They're the things that are being scanned and probably going to be exploited first. But those web application servers usually are receiving incoming communications, incoming connections from the outside world, and then they're responding to those. And they probably only make outbound communications to a handful of API servers that they might use, or a very well-defined set of external systems. So if you have monitoring of or logging of just net flow that shows you if connections are being made internally or externally from those web application servers or anything that you've identified as vulnerable, you can now do queries to look for anything that is an outlier to that normal pattern, and then just go in and investigate that. That is really, really useful to do. Something else that you can do is look at suspicious DNS queries. This assumes that you're logging DNS. I know that's a very difficult source to log just because there's so much data. But if you can't log DNS for your entire network, at least be logging DNS for those systems that are vulnerable that you've identified. Like Tyler said, the most damaging attack from this is remote code execution. That's what a lot of attackers have been focused on. But there is another attack vector that we have seen being exploited in the wild, where the attacker is just trying to get environment variables and exfiltrate that over DNS. So in that case, you would not see any suspicious child processes being spawned on the server, and you wouldn't see any suspicious outbound communications being established. Instead, you would see a DNS lookup to your regular DNS resolver that would contain maybe some sensitive data. So if you've got DNS logs, you might be able to see something like your AWS keys or some kind of an authentication token or a secret being requested as a subdomain or a host name of some really weird looking DNS domain name. That is something that you definitely want to spot, and probably looking at the DNS logs, or if you've got the logs being generated by the vulnerable application, those are the only places that you would even see that. And then, of course, your incident response is to revoke and reset those secrets right away so that you don't have lasting damage from that. If you do not normally have the commands curl or wget that run from those application servers, if that's not part of the normal baseline of activity, look for any invocations of those. Just practically speaking, a whole lot of the attacks that we're seeing out in the wild are using wget or curl. In fact, most of them that I've seen use both. They just try each one to see which one works. And what they're doing is using wget or curl to grab a payload that's a bash shell script from the attacker's infrastructure, and then just piping that directly to bash. And that'll give the attacker a remote shell or install some follow-on malware or something like that. You might also look for the process on your web application server that handles the incoming requests, spawning some unusual child processes. So we put bash on here as an example, but really just look at what is normal for that web application server overall. You might need to narrow your results down to just the process that normally handles those incoming connections. That's the vulnerable process. And assuming that you can't isolate that or shut it down while you're monitoring it, just look for what child processes does it normally spawn. In some cases, as I've been doing threat hunting, there's application servers that normally don't spawn any child processes. That's the best case scenario. Then you can just set up a custom alert for this Java process on this server spawning anything else. If anything else happens, make that an alert, make your SOC go investigate that and see if there is a compromise that's just happened. Also, this is not a panacea, but looking for crypto mining activity. Practically speaking, the payloads that have been delivered for the most part, at least the ones that have been reported publicly, have been crypto miners. You should not rest easy and think that's all that attackers are going to do with this. That's just the loudest thing that most people notice right away. But you would like to know if you've got a crypto miner running, and then you might, in the course of investigation, figure out that you had a vulnerable server that you didn't even know about before. So keeping an eye on things like that. One of the ways that we've looked at that is look at CPU usage. If you're monitoring CPU usage, it usually spikes on those servers. That's something you'd probably investigate anyway. And then look for DNS requests for any of the crypto mining pools. And we've got a list of those domain names out on the Binary Defense GitHub, if that's handy for you. Next slide. Something else that you can consider is active detection. So in most organizations, you'll probably prioritize for remediation and monitoring those systems that are listening for incoming connections from the public internet, right? All those things on the perimeter outside of your internal network. However, I want you to consider the fact that if you have some internal vulnerable servers, the only thing really separating an attacker from scanning from the outside and an attacker scanning from the inside is if one employee opens up a piece of malware that gives the attacker some inside advantage or some inside position on your network, and then they can pivot through that employee's workstation to do scanning inside your network and try and find those vulnerable servers too. Those might be in your environment more valuable if they have secret information or something else that you think should be protected. So something that you would probably want to identify is if any internal IP address, anything inside your network is scanning servers and sending any of these malicious payloads. One of the ways that you can do that is with a honeypot. Now, one of the things that the Binary Defense MDR software has is honeyports, where it's listening for random scanning all the time, and it's not just limited to this particular attack. So that's a great way to implement it if you've got that. There's also canary tokens and lots of other commercially available honeypots that will listen for incoming connections. Just this morning, I put together this really simple honeyport or honeypot for your internal networks. All it does is it listens on a port that you ask it to. It serves up an HTTP page that looks like a login page. And then it looks for all of the HTTP headers and all of the form fields that have been submitted by an attacker, whether they're in that login form or not. And if anything looks suspicious, if it's got a $, an open curly brace, then it records all of the headers, it records the IP address that sent it in, and then it sends you a message on your Slack or your Teams or Mattermost or whatever kind of team chat you've got. So feel free to take advantage of that. Like I said, I just wrote it this morning and just got the Docker container working. So if you have any issues with it at all, reach out to me. I'll be happy to help you fix it. And I'd be glad for any feedback on that. You also can be doing other kinds of active detection for anything that is unusual in your network. If you're monitoring user agent strings, you could look for something from curl or wget if that's not normal in your environment, if people don't normally use those tools, and see if some of those user agent strings go outbound. Next slide. Just to give you a few examples of some of the payloads that we've seen. This is really useful because as you are looking through your logs, you are going to be looking for things that look like this. When you see something like this, that indicates that someone tried to attack or scan or profile the system that received that request. It does not mean that the system that processed that request is vulnerable, right? People are just throwing these kind of strings in every conceivable HTTP header and in every conceivable form field at anything that they can get on the internet or anything that they can get to answer to a web request. So if you're just scanning for these incoming, you'll see the things that that people have tried scanning in your network. Some of these scans might be actually legitimate things like Shodan or Binary Edge or Cryptos Logic or any of these other companies that do scanning of the internet. Those are not necessarily malicious. Well, those are not malicious at all. They're not going to do anything on your system. But you're also going to see an awful lot of attackers from really weird looking domains and random IP addresses all over the world who are also sending these things in. What you're looking for is really anything that the application logs. So the application might log the user agent string, they might log the HTTP referrer, they might log some special XAPI version or some other kind of HTTP header, or they might log things like the username submitted to a form or something like that. If a vulnerable application logs one of these things in something that the attacker has sent in, that can cause the vulnerable server to make a call out back to the attacker's server. So in some of these examples, you can see that they're passing base 64. That's not a native thing that JNDI just accepts base 64. That's actually a kind of a complicated attack where the attacker is requesting your vulnerable server to make an LDAP request back to an LDAP server controlled by the attacker. The attacker is then responding to that with a serialized Java object that's supposed to represent the LDAP response, but actually when it gets deserialized, it can run some of these commands. The basic command base 64 is not the only thing that you can do with that. And there's lots and lots of creativity that's happening. The other thing I want you to notice is the obfuscation that's happening. So when you know that you're looking for patterns like this, you might do something like, well, just search in my logs for anything that says JNDI:LDAP, right? That'd be really simple and straightforward. The problem with that is attackers can do things really fancy, like that lowercase l and lowercase d, or put in random environment variables that aren't going to result in anything. They'll just be a blank string, and then they can append those to other strings. So actually, I've been impressed and amazed by the wide variety and creativity in some of the attack strings that I've seen obfuscated so far. But just know that you need to cast kind of a wide net. And the approach that I've been taking is just look for anything that looks unusual in anything that's logged. Like I'll just look for $ open curly brace, because that's something attackers cannot obfuscate, and then go through the results and then just start culling out all the things that are normal, and then just look at the things that are left. Once you get some of these in your logs, you might need to do a little bit more investigation to figure out what is the attacker's server, what is the base 64 command that's run. You can just decode that command, and then you can follow on to do investigation in your logs to see, did this machine that this attack was sent against actually make an outbound communication to that attacker server? Did it run the commands that are in that base 64 string? Anything like that. Those are really the steps that we've been taking to monitor and respond. And I think we're to questions now, right?
Yep, let's get some questions. We've got quite a few to run through here really fast. So what are the file sizes of the class files? I'd like to speed up my find for MD5 sum commands to find the appropriate files. Do we know the size of the?
No, I don't think, I mean, Randy, unless you have that down somewhere, but I don't think that you can really search by that, because every application is going to have a different class file. Some of them are going to be, some of the log4j classes are going to be, embedded within other classes. So it's not just a simple of looking for specific file sizes or hashes.
Yeah, let me also add on to that. One of the things that I was doing over this weekend was writing some deliberately vulnerable applications in Java. And I have to say that's surprisingly easy. Like there's all these different frameworks that are available. And as soon as you just start using some of the frameworks, you don't even need to say that I want, as a developer, you don't even need to say I want to use log4j. Like it just gets added to your project automatically when you use these templates. The other thing is that the jar files, the Java archive files that contain log4j might be contained inside of another jar file. So they can be buried many nested layers deep. And using a tool like the one that Tyler recommended, that Sift, that actually works really well. You can point that at a Docker image or at a jar file, and it will recursively look inside that at all the jar files embedded within jar files, embedded within jar files, and it will report back all the versions of the packages. And then you can look for log4j to pop up, which it often does, and see which version it is that's inside that package.
Next question is this wormable? Any indications of automation spreading? And then there's a second related question here. Who has seen log4j worm activity? Threat intel suggests it could occur today or tomorrow.
So yes, I would say that this is absolutely wormable. This has all the markings of being able to become a worm. Randy, on the binary defense side, have you all seen any indication that this has started to happen yet?
No, we have not seen that indication, but I am in the same bandwagon as you, just experimenting with this. The fact that you can remotely, grab a shell script and run it, and the simplicity by which you can launch the attack with just a one-line command line thing using curl or wget, that to me, that makes it really obvious that it's very wormable. And I think that the fact that we haven't seen it is just because of where we're looking in our particular clients, that they're pretty well protected in general. But that does seem like something that will likely come up in the near future if it hasn't already started happening.
And I'm just going to add, if you're going to see this happen, it's most likely going to be on the older versions of Java with the vulnerable version, because you can do serialization exploits on the newer versions of Java, but you need to match specific Java types and things like that, which would slow it down a little bit. But the older versions, you can just do the straightforward command execution. So there's going to be a little bit of variance there, but we're going to add that.
Next question: for some Windows-based applications, we have seen log4net.dll. Any comments if this is vulnerable or related at all? I kind of know that one a little bit. So log4net's an open source library for .NET applications. It seems to be different from log4j, so different.
So the exploit relies on JNDI, which is part of Java. So there could be a comparable function in this, but since JNDI is not part of .NET, there shouldn't be an overlapping issue.
Is there a good way to determine when log4j was patched on Linux, Mac, or Windows? Did we patch it or did somebody else patch it? Is the question, because obviously we've started to see some attackers actually patch the systems after they've gained access so that other attackers don't have access to it. Is there any good way to determine potentially when it was patched? I guess you'd have to look at modification date, right? Or creation date, modified.
Yeah, that would be my thought, is you'd have to look at when the files were modified and kind of go from there to see if your activity was related to that or somebody else's.
Yeah, I think something important to understand about it is that this is not like something that you're going to get in a Debian package or something like that. Like the vulnerable jar file can just be replaced by a different jar file inside of your custom application, and that would be sufficient for patching. And it could be patched, I mean, on the same server, it could be patched in one application and not in another.
And I think one other thing, and Randy, I think you even saw this when you were messing around with some things. There are lots of quote unquote updated Docker instances, applications, virtual machines out there, which are still vulnerable to this. So just because you download the latest and greatest version of an app and for Docker or whatever, does not mean it still does not have a vulnerable version of log4j within it.
Yeah, just yesterday, I created a brand new Spring Boot Java application, and it by default downloaded the 2.14.1 version of log4j. I went on the website for Spring Boot, and they said, "Yeah, we're aware of this, and we're gonna get an update out. Like we're gonna start updating this next week or something like that." So even people who are developing brand new Java applications might be getting vulnerable versions built into their new applications. Now, hopefully they'll be aware and they'll fix it pretty quickly. Somebody asked the question, what frameworks can you use to create quick vulnerable apps? Apache Solr seems to be the easiest one just to get set up that it is vulnerable right off the bat. You can also use Spring Boot, but you need to specifically bring in log4j log as the default logging, because the default logging is just logger on that if you don't change it. And so you wouldn't see the vulnerable behavior.
How effective is using Windows WMIC to possibly find infected hosts? I think there's two parts to that, right? Is that there's so many different variables, and this is why this is so bad, is that, you literally have to go through every Java application on your system. You literally, I mean, a vulnerability scan or just querying the operating system isn't going to return this information. You literally got to go through all the packages that are installed to ensure they don't have the vulnerable versions in your applications, right? So I don't know if WMIC would be a good way of reporting that. You wouldn't really have relevant data around that specific version. You'd have to go to the, you literally have to perform or conduct a scan, I think, of every operating system that you have for the specific vulnerable libraries. Is that correct?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, that's to find vulnerable systems. If you're talking about to find systems compromised through this,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge undertaking in and of itself as well. You know, it's not just, you know, while we gave you some indicators in the beginning of this to look for, you know, if you have a targeted attacker, they can do anything that they want. And so, you know, there's going to be a lot of things that you need to look for outside of what we've talked about. You basically need to do a threat hunt looking for any suspicious activity. I can't remember. Sorry, I can't remember who it is. But somebody tweeted yesterday about, you know, one of the quick easy things that you can do on like a Linux system is do a find command looking for anything created within like the last, you know, 4 to 7 days. You know, that might give you some indicators, but again, there's going to be a lot of manual analysis that you need to go through. And I know that's not, you know, the same as WMI, but you know, it's still the same concepts.
Yeah, I think there's actually two different approaches for finding vulnerable applications. One of them is, you know, your own custom applications in your company, and then that's going to be the hardest because you need to search all of the package dependencies that are involved, and your software developers might not even know that some dependency that they used also had log4j buried in it somewhere. But there's also looking for commercially available applications that are vulnerable, like VMware vCenter, right? So those are known version numbers that have been announced by the software manufacturer, the vendor. Those are going to be changing all the time, so you definitely need to keep up to date on what versions are vulnerable. But having, you know, any kind of endpoint software inventory management system that lets you query, you know, what is the latest version of this software installed on my system, that can just tell you, you know, if you've got the right version or not. That still is a whole lot of work, and you know, keeping those inventories up to date is so difficult in a large enterprise, but at least it's somewhere to start. Something else, this is kind of a crazy trick, but it has worked and has been effective in kind of the initial response to this. Looking in your EDR logs or in your sysmon logs or just your event ID 4688 logs for any process starting that had in the command line arguments or anywhere in the path log4j, that's not going to cover all the bases. It's definitely not. But it has surprisingly resulted in identifying some servers that we otherwise might not have gotten to right away, and it was a quick and easy thing to do. So I think in, you know, these early days, this first week of dealing with this, there's going to be a whole lot of imperfect and incomplete things that get you somewhere. Even though they're not perfect, you might as well try some of these things that are quick and easy to discover your vulnerable systems. Really, anything that you can do just to find a couple more is going to put you that much farther ahead.
Great. Could Android and iPhones be impacted by this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when this first started to come out, somebody posted a demonstration online showing how you could change, I think it was the host name of an iPhone with this. So yes, it can absolutely be affected. And then not only that, you know, in the kind of core mobile operating system, but you know, you could also have an application on your phone that uses log4j. So.
Yeah, so let me correct that, or at least say what my differing opinion is. I think that the iPhone trick was somebody setting their iPhone host name in order to exploit servers that the iPhone might have logged into, or that it touched, that the system logged the iPhone's name. I think that Androids are probably going to be a lot more susceptible because most Android apps are written in Java. Whereas for iPhone, you're not generally writing in Java. I'm not sure of a way to even do that.
Yep.
Good point.
Are there suggested techniques to help our family members scan their home networks for vulnerable systems, including routers, DVRs, security cameras, and other IoTs? I know there's been a number of scanners that have been released. I know Florian made one, a few others that will actively scan your network looking for, you know, various strings. But the problem with this one, again, is like, you know, any dynamic or custom application, you know, you need to understand those form fields and what they're putting in there. One of those may be vulnerable, right? So, but I mean, at least a basic scanner or something like that, that could go through their network to see if there's any vulnerable devices.
I would probably add that you want to take a look at, if you're doing a net forwarding, things that are internet facing first. Even then the rest of your IoT devices, even if you do identify one, you're still at the mercy of the vendor's, patch process, right? Like
Right.
you find one, you're going to unplug it, or, if you use VLANs at home and whatever else, you can put controls around it. But I would definitely take a look at things you port forward in. So like the DVR is a good example. People might put those on the internet directly. Things like that, I'd take a hard look at. After that, I kind of just, check with your big vendors for what you have. For example, I have Ubiquiti stuff and I thought it was auto updating and would have patched this. And I found out that it stopped auto updating a couple months ago. So.
Have you seen the use of invoke rest method versus wget or curl in India attacks you reviewed?
I have not.
I have not either, but that doesn't mean that that's not going to happen. And, at some point, attackers, they're smart. Once we figure out a way to detect or block, they're going to find a way around it. So just because, and just to state too, just because we haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not going on. We don't have, we're not omniscient into every attack that's going on. But as far as I know, I haven't heard of that being used yet.
Got it. If a firewall blocks all outbound traffic except for a specific allowed list of URLs and domains, does that mitigate the issue, or is it not that simple?
So I'll just add. So I answered for, but I'll add that if it can do recursive DNS lookups, you can still leak environment variables and secrets and things like that. So even if you're potentially blocking, like a reverse shell or something like that, if it can do recursive DNS lookups, there's still some exposure there. I don't know if Randy had anything else.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Look at that.
Although I do want to shout out to whoever said that. Like, that is a strong network posture that is going to save you from lots and lots of headaches. So, if you can pull that off, good.
Please do that. Please do that.
I also think it is super important that we shout out to the Log4j development team.
Yeah.
Open source software is really difficult to maintain. It's a thankless volunteer task that people just keep plugging away and doing their best at. And they don't get any recognition until something horrible happens. Then everybody points a finger at them. But I just want to point out that when this was released to the world last Thursday night, the Log4j team went in and started working on a patch right away and released that 2.15 the next day. That is amazing. So kudos to them, really.
Yep, agreed. This one's a good one, I think, and this is probably goes down to my heart of what is most concerning to me. So I think when this exposure came out, we started looking at this like, hey, this is bad, but how big is the exposure? Like how many, how prominent is this? And as we start to go down the list, we start to see, hey, there's hundreds, if not thousands of applications, network devices, things like that that are potentially impacted by this or that are impacted by this. And so the question was, any thoughts on how this impacts companies like Kronos, UKG, the payroll processing company that get hit over the weekend via ransomware? I guess that's one of my biggest concerns here is that you see these various different groups, whether it's nation states taking advantage of this very quickly, or it's ransomware groups that are building out these capabilities to use this type of attack in a ransomware type of scenario. Is that a major concern for you? I know it is for me. I know ransomware groups using this and being able to gain access, as an initial foothold for remote code execution is always a potential. And, now this is a whole new exploratory avenue where they can start going through dynamic applications that are externally facing, manually combing through these where they're basically looking for this exposure. I think it's going to be one of those ones that lasts for years, not something that's going to be addressed in a week or a month or 6 months. It's going to be a major problem moving forward.
Yeah, I agree with that too. This is not something that's going to be fixed tomorrow or next week. Like you said, we're going to be dealing with this for who knows how many years down the road. One thing to kind of say about that, if you look at kind of the flow of when a new vulnerability like this gets released, you always have crypto miners as the first ones to jump on it, which is exactly what we saw. And then it moves into ransomware. We've already seen some ransomware groups have adopted this attack and are starting to use it. Now, whether or not UKG was compromised because of this, that is unknown. That's all speculation. They haven't released those details. My gut says it is unlikely that this was used to compromise them because ransomware attackers tend to be in an environment for a little while before they deploy the ransomware. So, somebody getting hit this weekend, to me, that seems pretty quickly to move for an organization of that size. But that being said, and Randy, I want to get your thoughts on this too. We will absolutely see ransomware using this in the coming weeks, months, years.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, ransomware just looks for, or ransomware threat groups just look for access to systems, right? And I'd say that most of the time they have a lot of access available through access brokers that sell things privately or in wholesale, and through all of the phishing and the malware and the botnets like Emotet, getting into systems. That gives them ample opportunity. Don't think of this as like something separate and different and like this is what ransomware groups use and this is what nation state groups use. This is just an initial access vector. Anybody can make use of it. And I think the threat groups that have the most money to spend are probably going to be buying access from the people who've done the early work of getting footholds in all these systems. Now, the good news for defenders is that because of that kind of ecosystem, for the most part, you do have some time. Usually it's not just like minutes or hours after initial access that you've got ransomware going on. There's usually many telltale signs in between. If you don't already follow the DIFR report, they've got great details from intrusions that resulted in ransomware, where they describe all of these profiling commands that were run, all of the escalation of privileges to try and get to the domain controller from wherever they landed, all of these things that attackers do to profile the domain and to establish a foothold. That's where you have a great opportunity for detection. That's really where the binary defense team is focused, is on detecting those immediate post-compromise indications of compromise, because while the threat, the intrusion vector of the day might change all the time, it might be wild and difficult to detect. The actions that attackers take once they've got a foothold are usually predictable, and they're the same kind of goals that they always have. So focusing on those things, like don't get panicked just because this is a new way for people to get into your systems. There's always been ways for people to get into your systems. Focus on the things that you can detect and quick response once somebody gets a foothold.
Did you mention a report? By the way, someone asked what report was just mentioned, and I didn't hear that part.
I don't know either.
Okay.
No. I think we haven't mentioned it specifically, but both Binary Defense and Trusted Sec posted blogs. They're very similar, so you could read either one probably. But we've got a lot of links in there to resources, and we're going to keep those updated as best we can as information is changing all the time. So please feel free to use the blogs and all the links and resources in there too.
Yep. And it hit on Randy's point too. The reason why this is so challenging from a detection perspective, there's a question here: does the top managed EDR prevent this? And the short answer to that is prevent no. Because there's a lot of things happening in this case where it's abusing a library that's embedded inside of an application. That application may or may not log it. You may not have logs to be able to see it in the first place. That's why it's so difficult. This is why it's such a bad issue. It's not like something we could, you can write a specific detection off of very quickly. And that's why it's really important, to scan your systems to understand if you have this vulnerability, but also having the detection criteria for post-exploitation scenarios that you can identify in the event that something like this is compromised. So, did they land a shell on there? Are they doing command and control? Are they doing privilege escalation? Are they moving to other systems? These are all things that, we have to have from a response perspective to handle these types of situations. And so, a specific product typically is not going to protect against this. Unfortunately, it's built into the insides of an application, which is why it's so difficult to actually go through and respond to. Another question. I support
was about the DIFR report. I put the link into the chat.
Oh, perfect. Thanks. One of them was, I support a blood research building and we have instruments hooked up to the network, and most of our vendors have not heard of this and have no clue. Should we just unplug them from the network? I'd probably say no, don't unplug your blood supply devices. But in stating that, I think the big component here is you need to start doing inventory of your systems and which ones are vulnerable and testing those out and trying to work with the vendors as much as possible to get are they vulnerable or not, to get some sort of response back from them. They need to be investigating this as well. And this is why, especially in the medical industry, it's really important to understand, to have this is not going to fix it right now, but moving forward, having good legal documentation around what a vendor is responsible for from a risk management perspective to say if there are critical exposures out that they will address them within a reasonable time period. So having those in your contracts so that when you purchase them from this, they're actually able to support and maintain those, which I think is really important. I understand, the complexities of medical. We deal with a lot with hospitals and, emergency rooms and things to that effect. It's not an easy task. And I think in those types of situations, segmentation, isolation, and strong SLAs that you have with your vendors are going to be really important in these scenarios moving forward.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna reiterate what Dave said. This feels like a really good way for you to get buy-in to do network segmentation of these devices. I've worked in hospital environments. I know what it's like. I know that people will just put random things on in the environment, for good reason, so because they're going to save lives. But getting that network segmentation in place is going to go a long way, and this is a great opportunity to push for that. Randy?
Those are really great points. I've also worked with those medical devices, and they end up just being a black box that usually you can't touch, and it's very, very difficult to get the vendors to do anything to help you out. Forget about getting logs off of them. But something that is really helpful in those situations is network monitoring. Like really, really focus on monitoring the network outbound and inbound to those systems. Use something like Security Onion, Suricata. There's lots of different ways that you can monitor the network traffic. And then you've got the ability passively, without having to mess around with the network traffic, you can detect a whole lot of threats just by looking at that.
Yep. There's a question here. We'll wrap it up in a few minutes here. But I heard that there's a Git post around 9 months ago. Does anybody know if this has been around for a while or myth? There was a Black Hat presentation given back in 2016, kind of showing some exposures potentially with this, but it was not like a one-to-one correlation, and it was a very different type of attack avenue. It didn't go into the full details of remote code execution and everything else. So this is newly discovered in every capacity. We haven't seen any indication this has been around for a long time. That Black Hat presentation definitely outlined that there are potential attack avenues for this, but there was no exploit code, and there was no reason to believe that this was something that could happen into embedded dependencies and classes in this specific application.
And the earliest that I've heard of anybody actively exploiting this in the wild was December 1st. And that was just very minimal until it got announced to the world, and then it just skyrocketed.
Yep. Everybody's been focused on the server side. Is there any concerns on workstations? Yes, absolutely. Workstations are absolutely impacted by this as well. Third-party applications that you have installed, you name it. I mean, workstations are definitely part of what you need to be scanning as well from a dependency perspective. That's why good configuration management, things like that is really important in understanding, hey, these are the types of applications that we have installed in our environment, and let's go through those and identify which ones may have this specific exposure for Log4j, and then rolling those patches out to your impacted workstations. But absolutely, workstations are definitely a concern. I would say it's less of a concern right now from an attack surface perspective. Your view should be fix your external perimeter, externally facing issues first, because that's going to be your highest criticality and risk, and then work on the inward assets and systems that you have to try to address those as well. You don't want remote code execution on the internet. That's the worst case scenario, the wild, wild west. Not saying you don't want to fix it internally as well, but time and resource dedication definitely should definitely be on your external perimeter by far. I think that's all the questions we have. That was a lot. That was good. That was really good, folks. And I appreciate all the interaction that we had from everybody. If we didn't answer your question, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to, we're on social media, you can email us, you can hit our contact us form, whatever you need. Happy to respond back to any of those that are out there. Actually had one last question. Ted came in with the last closing one. If you see any IOCs in the logs, does it necessarily mean that the host has been compromised? No, it doesn't. Randy kind of hit on this a little bit earlier, but just by seeing the log attempts does not mean that it was exploited successfully. It just means that there was an attempt there. And believe me, like right now, if you look at what we're seeing, there's millions of attempts happening all over the place for this specific issue. So they're scanning, the wide internet, they're looking for things. They're trying to find whatever they possibly can. So just because you see it in your log does not mean that there's an indication of a successful remote code execution perspective. Something you definitely want to dive into and analyze to see if you have those vulnerable components for Log4j, but does not mean successful exploitation there by any means. All right. Well, thank you all so much for hopping on today. We just wanted to get something quick together for everybody. I know this is a trying time for everybody. Really appreciate everybody hopping on and going through this. Best of luck to everybody. If you need any help and assistance, that's what we're here for. Really appreciate all you defenders out there right now working the midnight oil and trying to protect your organizations and companies. This is a real unfortunate one. And I really hope that, we come out of this much stronger and learning from this type of experience to hopefully prevent these in the future and what we can do to minimize these types of attacks. I think if you look at all of this, it's, listen, minimization of attack surface is so important, right? If a machine gets compromised, the ability for that to access the rest of your infrastructure and network, how do we look at that from a modeling perspective and start to build this into our organization side? I mean, we're seeing with supply chain attacks, we're seeing with third-party libraries, we're seeing it, from an externally facing perspective, we're seeing with phishing. How do we keep continuously minimizing our attack surface and responding when we do have an attack that's something like this? I think is really important. Any closing thoughts, gents?
I think it's really good to say thank you to the community. There's been a lot of really great collaboration. So thank you for everybody sharing knowledge, and we'll continue to give back and share knowledge as much as we can.
And I was just going to echo what Tyler said about this is a really good time to review, egress, kind of your strategy around DMZ and things like that. Obviously, the past couple of years between Exchange, Citrix, and all those different things that have been popping up, if you had some of those other mitigations in place, you could greatly limit, the exposure. So if this is the tipping point that makes your org rethink, your network structure, then, that's a win.
Awesome. Say anything better.
What's that?
I couldn't say anything better.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Well, thanks, Randy, over the binary defense front side, and Tyler and Justin on the Trusted Sec side. If you need us, that's what we're here for. That's what we do all day, every day. Tyler and Randy, I hope you all get some sleep soon and appreciate all that you do to protect our customers. But thank you all very much. Have a good one, everybody. Thanks again.
Thanks.